The solemn silence of the graduation ceremony was broken by an unexpected and incredibly touching moment. In the huge hall, full of students in gowns and guests with smiles on their faces, something suddenly appeared that no one could have predicted. A young woman dressed in a graduation uniform walked slowly down the central aisle, but in her hands, instead of a diploma, there was a bundle, a newborn child. The room froze. Step by step, she approached the stage where her diploma awaited her, symbolizing years of sleepless nights, hard work, and incredible dedication. But with each step, it became clear, this is not just a story about getting a diploma, it is a story about the power of the spirit, about how there are no insurmountable obstacles on the path to a dream. When she walked up to the stage with the baby in her arms, the hall was completely silent. Even the rector, who was used to handing out thousands of diplomas, froze for a moment, realizing that this was not just a graduate, but a heroine. A moment later, the hall burst into applause, loud, deafening, sincere. After all, this woman had just proven to the whole world that despite all the difficulties, despite the fact that life presents unexpected challenges, she continued to move forward. No one knew at that moment how much pain, doubt, and sacrifice was hidden behind her calm smile. But on that day, she stood there not only as a graduate, but also as a mother, as a symbol of resilience and inspiration for everyone. Before we continue this amazing story, let's get to know each other a little. Write in the comments where you are watching us from. Where are you right now, when this incredible moment unfolds before your eyes? She stood on the stage, holding her baby in her arms, and at that moment, all eyes were on her. Behind that applause was not only support, but also a silent question. How did she manage to get through all this? Only a few knew that her path was much more difficult than most of those sitting in this room. Alone in the final months of her pregnancy, she had to balance being a mother-to-be and a student preparing for final exams. Her college friends saw her as strong, but they didn't know that she often woke up in the night, choking with tears, terrified of not being able to cope with the two greatest challenges of her life. She had to finish her studies, get a degree that promised to change her life, and at the same time become a mother all at once, without a break, without the opportunity to stop. Every morning began with a struggle, getting up before everyone else to make it to class, and then returning home to no support or support. She spent her nights studying, clutching her hands to her stomach and praying for her baby to be born healthy. At some point, it seemed impossible, that no amount of strength would help her survive the year. But every morning, she got up and continued, for herself, for her child's future. And now, the day had arrived. The scenario she had been afraid to even dream about was now unfolding right before her eyes. When her name was called, she took a deep breath and hugged the baby tighter. This wasn't just an entrance onto the stage. It was an entrance into a new life. A life in which she showed everyone that a young mother had not only dealt with difficulties, she had conquered them. Many in the room understood that this moment was deeper than it seemed. This was not just a graduation ceremony, it was a triumph over circumstances. Her story became a symbol of faith in oneself, a symbol of the fact that a woman is capable of anything, even when life presents her with almost impossible tasks. Yet, beneath the calm exterior, there was a storm. Her heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of her chest. She knew she still had many trials ahead of her: loneliness, sleepless nights, looking for work, and caring for a child. But in that moment, on that stage, she allowed herself to taste victory, if only for a moment. That applause was for her, for every tear, every doubt, for every moment when she wanted to give up but kept going. As she stepped off the stage, holding her diploma in one hand and her baby in the other, the world around her no longer seemed so daunting. There was still a long road ahead, but now she knew she could do anything. When she stepped off the stage, everything seemed perfect: the diploma in her hand, her small child sleeping quietly on her chest, and the loud applause still echoing in her ears. But behind this image of triumph lay a secret that only a few knew, and perhaps this day would reveal the truth she had been running from for so long. In the crowd, she saw a face she never expected to see at that moment. At the far end of the room, as if time had stopped for a moment, stood a man, his gaze fixed on her. This was the father of her child. the man who had disappeared months before the baby was born, leaving her alone. He hadn't answered his calls, hadn't appeared in her life, and she had come to terms with his absence, forced to move forward without him. Her life had already become so fragile and complicated that she couldn't afford to fall apart from another disappointment. But now he was here, and he was coming toward her. His appearance was like a bolt from the blue, a blow that was impossible to avoid. Her heart sank, and her thoughts froze in her head. What right did he have to be here? At this moment, she didn't know what to do, run or stand still, but her legs refused to move. She stood rooted to the spot, feeling how all her emotions, which she had so carefully hidden, began to boil inside. She didn't know what to do with it yet, but there was something in his gaze, something she had not seen before, remorse, or maybe fear. He approached, stopping a few feet away from her. Their eyes met, and the tension between them was palpable, like a taut string about to snap. He opened his mouth to speak, but in that moment, for the first time, she realized that she wasn't ready to hear him explain. She had walked too long alone to get to this point, had put too much effort into rebuilding her life. But before she could say or do anything, a voice rang out as her name was announced on stage again. It turned out that she had won another award for academic merit. This was the second prize she had not known about. In disbelief, she slowly turned around and saw the rector gesturing for her to return. The crowd applauded again, but this time her mind was not filled with joy, but with utter confusion. The man came closer and said quietly, almost in a whisper, "We need to talk. I couldn't be there then, but I'm here now. Please, give me a chance to explain." But she wasn't listening anymore. The stage was waiting for her, and her child was next to her, the only thing that really mattered at that moment. She took a step forward, climbing onto the stage, and turned her head to take one last look at the man who had once been a part of her life. He stood there, his eyes full of emotion, but she couldn't let herself melt before his words. This was her day, her moment. She clutched her diploma tighter and walked back up to the stage, but somewhere deep inside she knew her life was changing again. This unexpected turn of events was just the beginning. When she returned home, there was no celebration in her mind. Her past and future had suddenly become intertwined, leaving her in limbo. She knew one thing: her fight was far from over. When she returned home after the day of triumph and shock, the silence of the apartment seemed deafening. Her little son was snoring softly in her arms, and her head was still ringing with the applause mixed with the arrival of the man who had broken her heart. That day should have been the beginning of a new life, but now it was again mixed with old memories and new fears. She knew that the past she had tried to leave behind for so long had caught up with her again, and this was only the first sign of new trials ahead. She had been through too much in the last few years. She was a young black woman navigating a world filled with hidden barriers. Once she got to college, it became clear to her that the academic environment was different, not always open and welcoming. Professors looked at her with prejudice, as if she couldn't do it. Her peers were often distrustful of her achievements, and sometimes ignored her altogether. She had to prove herself doubly every time she opened her mouth in class or turned in a paper, and that was just the tip of the iceberg. But what happened in college was just a reflection of the reality she lived in. She remembered one time, in her junior year, when a security guard stopped her at the entrance to campus and asked if she was in the wrong building. That question wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was emblematic of a system that relegated her, as a black woman, to the bottom. A system that constantly questioned her abilities, and didn't give her a chance until she proved herself to be twice as good as everyone else. When she became pregnant, her life became even more complicated. It felt like everything was against her. Even her friends and some of her professors advised her to take a sabbatical or rethink her priorities. Her status as a young parent only reinforced the stereotypes. A black woman, and a single mother at that? It seemed like the world was ready to write her off as a failure. She had to fight not only the prejudices of those around her every day, but also her own fears that she could never be successful, that her place in this world was always one step behind. But despite all this, she moved forward, breaking stereotypes and confronting everything that stood in her way. Until today, she believed that her triumph would be the final victory over all obstacles. However, the appearance of the father of her child made her remember that the fight is not over yet. Several days had passed since she had first seen him in the hall. He hadn't tried to contact her since the ceremony, and she had begun to believe that it had all been an illusion. But one evening, as she was returning home with groceries, she saw him standing at the entrance. Her heart sank with anxiety. He hadn't left. He seemed determined to talk. "We can't just leave it like this," he said as she came closer. "I couldn't be with you then, but I'm here now." Her answer was sharp and cold. "You weren't there when I needed you. What changed? Why should I trust you now?" He fell silent, his face pained, but she couldn't afford to feel sorry for him. Too much time had passed. Too many tears had been shed. "I know I made a mistake." His voice shook, "but I wasn't given a choice. My family, they didn't accept us. They thought being with you was a mistake. They saw a problem with everything, starting with the color of your skin. I was young and scared, but now I know I'm ready to fight it. I'm ready to stand up to them for you and our son." Her heart pounded in her chest. These were the words she had always wanted to hear, but they came too late. His family had never accepted her. They had always been prejudiced against her, seeing her as that black girl. The moment she became pregnant, the situation became unbearable. They insisted that he forget about her and find the right woman, and he listened to them, leaving her at her most difficult moment. "Do you realize I've been through hell without you?" Her voice was full of pain, but there was pride in it too. "You think you can just come back, say a few words, and I'll let you back into my life? Into our son's life?" He hung his head, and she knew it was just as hard a conversation for him. But even so, her trust in him was shattered forever. He had allowed his family's racism to ruin their future, and now she didn't know if it could be restored. But what scared her even more was that racism wasn't just a family drama, but part of a larger problem that she faced at every turn. It wasn't just his family, it was the world she had to live in every day. A world where she always felt one step behind, where she had to work twice as hard to prove her right to a place in the sun. Her skin color was like an invisible barrier that she felt everywhere, at university, at work, even in the hospital, where she had to deal with the doctor's distrust when she went to see them during her pregnancy. Now she had a choice: go back to the man who had already betrayed her once because of social pressure, or keep moving forward, relying only on herself. She knew one thing: the world had not changed in these few months. Prejudice and racism were still there, and she would still have to fight, but she had already learned to be strong. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said finally, "but my son deserves to know his father. If you're ready to be a part of his life, this is your chance. But know this, I won't forgive you again if you leave again." He nodded, his eyes full of gratitude, and promised he wouldn't leave again, but she knew that words weren't everything. Now was the time for action, and they had to contend not only with their personal demons, but with a society that continued to see them as a threat, not a family. When she returned home that night, her heart was still full of doubts, but she knew one thing: she had been through worse, and if anyone tried to break her or her family, she would stand firm until the end, just like she always did. A few months passed, and life began to return to normal. He did stay, unexpectedly. Contrary to her expectations, he tried to be there, visiting the child, helping her with everyday tasks, and gradually they began to build a new, fragile trust. But the tension associated with their past was like a smoldering fire, ready to burst into flames at any moment. She could no longer simply forget everything she had experienced, and she couldn't help but feel that their life together had now become something difficult, almost like walking on a knife edge. The racism that had once divided them had not disappeared from their lives. It was all around them, even if they tried not to notice it. Every time they went out with their child, the looks from passers-by were telling. The first time they went to a cafe just to have coffee, the waiter greeted them with cold politeness, and the people at the next table began whispering. She was angry at the way people reacted to their family, as if interracial relationships were still something wrong or unusual. One such day, as they were sitting in the park enjoying time with their son, an elderly couple approached them. The man was clearly displeased, his face expressing disapproval. "Is this your child?" he said contemptuously towards the baby's father. Her partner suddenly tensed, ready to respond, but she took his hand, stopping him. She knew how easy it was to give into anger and get into a fight. but in that moment she decided that she would not let these people get the better of them. "Yes, this is our son," she answered calmly, looking intently into the man's eyes. "It won't be easy for him in this world," the man said dryly, casting one last glance at them before leaving. It wasn't the first time she'd encountered such a thing, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. The world was still not ready to accept families like theirs, and the more she saw of it, the deeper her old fears began to take hold. Her son, with his mixed heritage, had been under the pressure of being different since birth. She was worried about him growing up in a world where he would be judged not by his character, but by the color of his skin and his background. One night, after they had both put the baby to bed, she brought it up openly with her partner. They sat on the couch in silence, and it seemed like the topic had been in the air for a long time. "I'm afraid for our son," she admitted. Looking at him, "I'm afraid he'll have to deal with the same thing I've dealt with all my life. You've seen the way people look at us. Even those who don't say anything out loud have already branded him in their minds." He nodded slowly, clearly unsure of what to say. The topic was new to him, not because he didn't know about racism, but because he hadn't experienced it to the same extent as she had. His privilege as a white man gave him an invisible protection that she never had. "I understand how you feel," he said quietly, "and I was blind to it before. I admit it. When my family turned against you, I didn't fully understand how deep it went. I thought it was just our personal problems, but in reality it was the system that was against us from the beginning. But now, when I see how people react to us and our son, I realize it more and more." He paused before continuing, "I want to be there to help him through this. I can't change everything around him, but I promise he won't be alone." Her eyes filled with tears, and she suddenly began to cry. All the tension, fears and worries that she carried inside suddenly burst out. She was used to being strong, used to dealing with everything on her own, but now she realized that she no longer wanted to be alone in this fight. "I don't know what this is going to be like," she said, trying to hold back her sobs. "But I do know one thing, I don't want my son to feel different anymore. I want him to grow up in a world where he's judged on his merits, not his background." He leaned closer, hugged her and whispered, "We will do everything to make him feel that he is the same as everyone else, that he is special and strong. We will be his protection." These words gave her some comfort, but she knew that the world was too cruel and complicated to completely protect their son from everything. She saw how the world treated black men, and her heart sank with fear that one day her boy would become a target. As a mother, she wanted to shield him from all injustices, but the reality was that she could not control everything. A few months later, when her son was 1 year old, she received an offer to work for a prestigious company. It was what she had dreamed of, a great position with the possibility of career growth. But with this offer came another test. One day at a meeting, one of the managers, without embarrassment to those present, said, "We're proud to have such a diverse team, including our black employees. It looks good on the books." The words hit her hard in the gut. She felt like she was being treated like a statistic, a necessary part of showing that the company was inclusive. She knew she was a professional, had worked her way up to this position, but now all her accomplishments were being reduced to the color of her skin once again. On the way home, all the fears and doubts came flooding back to her. She didn't want her success to be overshadowed by racial prejudice, nor did she want her son to grow up feeling that his place in life would be defined by those same stereotypes. Her fight for justice, for herself, for her child, for their family, was just beginning. Her job at the prestigious company seemed like a dream come true at first. She was recognized for her accomplishments, signed a major contract, and became one of the few black women at the company to hold a leadership position. But once the real work began, she had to face the harsh truth. People around her didn't always see her as a professional. Despite all her successes, she constantly felt the eyes on her. Some secretly admired her resilience, but most people around her just saw her as a quota, someone whose presence was beneficial to the company to maintain the appearance of diversity. Every day, her inner tension grew. She tried to ignore the small but heartbreaking comments like, "You're only here because they wanted to show that they support inclusion," or "Black women are rare in our office. You should be lucky." Each of these phrases was a knife to the heart, as if she had entered a world where her true talents were not cared for. Her merits were being questioned. One day, at a regular meeting, she had to present the results of a long project that she had been developing with her team. It was an important moment that could determine the future vector of her career. She had prepared perfectly, knew every detail, and was ready to answer any questions. But when she started speaking, the company's top manager interrupted her mid-sentence, took the floor, and simply ignored her further suggestions, continuing to present other people's ideas as his own. Everyone in the room fell silent, and she had to restrain her hands from shaking. It wasn't the first time she'd been slighted like this, but she knew it wasn't a fluke. She was too easy a target, a young black woman whose accomplishments could be taken away. But the feeling of helplessness in that moment gripped her so tightly that she almost lost her composure. After the meeting, she headed to her office, feeling like something had broken inside her. The walls she had spent years building around herself to protect herself from outside pressure were cracking at the seams. An inner voice was telling her that she deserved more, but the world around her seemed to be trying to prove her wrong. That evening, when she returned home, she found an envelope in her mailbox. It was a letter from a senior activist at a local civil rights organization who had supported her years ago during her studies. She hadn't expected to see him, much less hear from him. The letter was short, but it contained an unexpected offer to speak at a major event on racial discrimination in the corporate world. They knew her story, her successes and her failures, and they saw her as a symbol of the very struggle she lived every day. This was a chance to speak out, to put it all on the line, and she knew that the invitation had come at a time that was no coincidence. She hesitated. This move could change her career forever, and not necessarily for the better. In the corporate world, her bold statement could be seen as rebellion, as betrayal, especially if her superiors found out about it. She knew that being inconvenient meant risking everything she had achieved, but it was important for her to tell her truth. She couldn't stay silent any longer. Having made up her mind, she agreed to perform. The day of the speech was tense. Her partner was supportive, but there was concern in his eyes, too. He knew this speech could be her triumph, or it could be the potential downfall of her career. She walked up to the microphone in front of a large audience of activists, journalists, and business representatives. Her gaze wandered around the room until it finally landed on the faces of those who had come to hear her story. She began to speak, slowly, confidently, gradually drawing everyone into a story about her years in college, the challenges she faced as a black woman, and the struggle for acceptance in the corporate world. But then, to everyone's surprise, she changed her tone. The hardest part, she said, is not the constant battle with overt discrimination. You get used to that. The hardest part is when people look at you and smile, saying you're here because of your abilities, but then, behind your back, they write off all your achievements as a racial quota. It destroys your trust in the system, in people, and in yourself. Her words caused shock in the room, but she continued, "My experience is just the tip of the iceberg. I've seen colleagues and friends go through the same thing, but they keep quiet because they're afraid of losing their careers. That's the real problem, that racism in corporate culture is often hidden behind smiles and pats on the back. It's not overt aggression, it's the insidious little things that eat you up from the inside." She fell silent, and the room went dead silent. She knew that her words could be the beginning of something big, but then something happened that no one expected. After her speech, a man in a formal suit approached her. He introduced himself as a representative of her company and informed her that management had learned of her speech. A cold fear gripped her. She knew that the consequences would be immediate. He offered to have a serious talk and made it clear that her career could be ruined for this step. She was called to a meeting with the company's management, and she knew that this could be her last day on the job. When she arrived at the office, the atmosphere was tense. Her boss greeted her with a cold face, and his first question was, "Do you understand the risk you are taking?" Her heart was beating like crazy, but some unshakable confidence was awakening inside. "Yes," she answered calmly, "and I'm ready to fight for it." At that moment, something unexpected happened. One of her colleagues, who had been silent the entire time, stood up and defended her. "She speaks the truth. I witnessed her ideas being stolen, and I am tired of remaining silent. It is wrong." Her colleague's words sparked a conversation, and others began to speak out, corroborating her story. Her managers, seeing that the company was facing an internal rebellion, realized that this was serious business. Her support grew before their eyes. That day, she not only saved her career, but also became a symbol of change within the company. The management had to reconsider its policies, and she was asked to become the face of a new program aimed at combating racial discrimination. But that wasn't the biggest turnaround. Within weeks, she learned that her speech had attracted the attention of major media outlets, and her story was being covered across the country. She was invited to appear on television, write articles, and share her experiences on major platforms. She suddenly found herself at the center of a national conversation about racism in corporate America. Now she was not just one of those who fight in the shadows. She became the voice of those who had been silent for many years, and her fight for justice continued. But now she knew that she was no longer alone in this battle. With each passing day, her life was evolving into something she could never have imagined. Her story, initially perceived as an isolated incident, was now a symbol of the struggle for Black women in corporate America. Newspapers published articles about her courage. TV stations invited her to give interviews, and activists cited her example to call for system change. But with her success came increasing tension and danger. She knew that by embarking on this path, she had attracted the attention of not only supporters, but also enemies and those who were willing to fight to maintain the status quo. One evening, when she returned home from a series of public appearances, her phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. She usually didn't answer such calls, but something made her pick up. "You talk too much," came a low, menacing voice. "Stop it before it gets worse." Her heart sank. She felt a cold sweat run down her skin. The voice was full of contempt and anger. It was not just a warning, it was a direct threat. She immediately understood that she was facing something much more dangerous than corporate injustice. This was a world where the fight for truth and justice could cost lives. She sat in silence for a long time, considering what to do. Should she call the police, or let it go? She knew threats were common in situations like this. People who stand in the way of change often face this kind of pressure, but this was new to her. She had fought against systemic injustice before, against something that was abstract, and now the enemy was real, threatening her personally. Without saying a word to her partner, she tried to suppress the fear inside her. She couldn't allow herself to panic. She had an important meeting with journalists the next day. She knew that if she let fear win, she would give in, like so many before her. But the threat, as it turned out, was not an empty phrase. A few days later, when she arrived at work, her car was smashed, the windshield was shattered, the tires were punctured, and on the hood was written in red paint, "Keep quiet or worse." She felt numb. Everything that was happening now seemed more than just a threat to her. It was a clear sign that her activism had provoked serious resistance. Deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. She went to the police, filed a report, but inside she felt it wasn't enough. Her partner began to insist that she leave town temporarily, take a break, but she couldn't give in so easily. That would mean she was letting her fear win, that her strength was just a temporary surge of courage. But despite her determination, anxiety about her family's future began to fill her thoughts. One of the hardest moments was when her son began to notice that something was wrong. He was only 2 years old, but he could feel the tension in the air, sense her anxiety. One day he asked, "Mom, why are you sad?" She couldn't answer. Her heart was breaking with the knowledge that her fight, which she was so proud of, was beginning to affect her family. Her fear for her son grew stronger with each passing day. She knew that her speeches and public statements had made her a target not only for those who supported racism, but also for those who would go to extreme lengths to stop her. Soon she was invited to speak at a major national human rights conference. It was one of the most prestigious events, and she knew that turning it down would be a step backwards. But at the same time, fear for her safety and the safety of her family was nagging at her. She decided to talk to one of her old friends who worked in security. He listened carefully to her story about the threats and the destruction of her car, and then said seriously, "This is not a joke. You have entered a zone where the game is played by different rules. These people will not stop. You must be ready." He suggested hiring security for her travels and events. She considered it. It was an admission that the danger was real, that her life was now at risk, but she also realized that she could no longer act as she had before. Her fight had reached a new level, and the stakes were higher. The day of the conference arrived. She stood backstage, watching the crowd that was gathering in the huge hall. There were representatives of human rights organizations, politicians, journalists. Hundreds of people's eyes were directed at her, waiting for her to take the stage again and tell her story as a symbol of the fight for justice. But there was someone else backstage, a stranger, not listed as one of the organizers, tried several times to get closer to her. A security guard stopped him, but he persisted. When he was finally escorted out of the building, she sensed that something was wrong. The excitement grew. Her heart was racing as she began her speech. She spoke with her usual confidence and passion, but this time her mind was elsewhere. There were several security guards in the room, and she found herself constantly watching their every move. And suddenly, in the middle of her speech, a loud sound rang out in the hall, a bang, like a gunshot. It all happened so fast that she didn't have time to process it. People started to get up from their seats, looking around, and then chaos. Security rushed towards her, surrounding her, while some of the audience tried to leave the hall. She was taken backstage, where she trembled as she tried to understand what had happened. Luckily, it wasn't a gunshot, but a microphone accidentally falling onto the stage. But the fear she felt in that moment was real. Her body shook, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly vulnerable. After the incident, she locked herself in her dressing room, trying to catch her breath. It was a turning point for her. She realized that the fight she had started had grown into something bigger. Her mission was no longer just her own story, it had become a national movement. But with it came the realization that the dangers she now faced were real, and her life could change forever. After the conference, she decided to retreat into the shadows for a while. Her son and family became her priority, but her story did not die down. The media continued to cover her speeches, and activists used her as inspiration to fight injustice. Her name became a symbol of change, and although she physically retreated from the public arena, her influence grew with each passing day. But even behind the scenes, she remained vigilant. She knew that one day she would have to return and continue this fight, but with new, more powerful weapons and broader support. Despite her decision to retreat into the shadows, life did not allow her to relax. She was at home with her family, trying to recuperate and bring a sense of normalcy back into their lives. But the calm was illusory. Every day was a reminder that her life was now forever changed. She remained in touch with activists who continued the fight on her behalf. But in her heart she increasingly felt that she was slowly losing control of her own story. Her actions were no longer hers alone. They had become a symbol for thousands of people who saw in her strength and inspiration. But no one knew the price she paid for it. Every day brought new threats, new looks that she felt when she left the house. She could no longer walk with her son or go to the store without worry. Her face was familiar to everyone, and fame had its dark side. The lonely nights were the worst. Sometimes she woke up from nightmares in which she saw her family being hunted and killed because of her open stance. Her fear for her son became unbearable, but she knew that it was no longer possible to take a step back. A few weeks after the conference, where she was nearly paralyzed by fear, something happened that changed everything. Her mother, who had always supported her in her struggle, was suddenly hospitalized with a heart attack. An ambulance had taken her away at night, and when she arrived at the hospital, the doctors had no guarantees. Lying on the hospital bed, her mother grabbed her hand and said, "You've taken on too much, my daughter. This world won't change that quickly. Sometimes you have to know when to back off." Those words seemed to pierce her heart. She knew that her mother said these words not out of fear for her life, but out of deep love and understanding. How many times they had faced racism together, from small hurtful words to outright humiliation. But her mother always taught her to stand her ground, believe in herself and fight for a better future. "I can't stop, Mom," she whispered, holding back tears. "I promised myself I wouldn't let them win. But they've already won if you lose yourself." The mother answered quietly, "Your health and your family are what's important. Your son needs you more than these people do." The words sank into her soul. She knew she was right, but the fear that retreat would be perceived as defeat haunted her. She left the hospital with a feeling of heaviness pressing on her chest. Several days passed after this conversation, when one evening the doorbell rang. She was not expecting guests, and this immediately put her on guard. When she opened the door, 2 policemen in uniform were standing on the threshold. They had serious, even sullen, faces. "Miss, we need to talk," one of them began. "We've received information about a possible threat to your safety." Her heart sank. She was used to such warnings, but something in the tone of these officers was different. They invited her to sit down and began to explain that Federal Security Services had received information that something more serious than simple threats was being prepared against her. "We think this is a plot to assassinate you," one of the officers said. "This is no longer just talk or vandalism. We have reason to believe that a group of radicals is planning a real attack on you and your family." Her head spun. The world, already full of threats, suddenly felt even more dangerous. Her son was sleeping upstairs, and the thought of someone coming to harm him was unbearable. "What should I do?" she asked, barely containing her panic. The police suggested she leave the city temporarily, send her son to safety, and enter witness protection to escape the threat. But that would mean leaving everything she had built, leaving the fight, leaving her life. She would no longer be able to speak publicly. She would no longer be able to continue telling her story. She was stuck. Her mother was in the hospital. Her son needed protection, and her own life was at risk. It felt like the walls were closing in on her. But the biggest shock of all was that shortly after, her mother died of a second heart attack. Her death was unexpected and devastating. She had no time to say goodbye. No time to hear another word of support from the one who had always been her strongest support. Now her mother was gone, and she was left alone to face all this. The mother's funeral was somber and filled with hidden pain. Her presence at the ceremony was under police protection. She could no longer appear in public places without an escort. People came to offer condolences, but deep down she felt isolated and cut off from everyone close to her. The day after the funeral, she received a letter that was the final blow. It was anonymous, but its contents made her blood run cold. "Your mother didn't die by accident. It was a warning. You're next." The words danced before her eyes, like poison seeping into her consciousness. She realized that her mother had been a victim of this monstrous system without even knowing it. All that stress, all that fighting for justice had taken its toll on her health, and now she couldn't protect her. Her death wasn't just a tragic event, it was the result of the pressure and injustice they had faced their entire lives. She clutched the letter, clutching it in her hands, feeling her rage rise. Her mother had died in this fight, and now she knew there was no way out. She could no longer retreat into the shadows. Her mother had been right about caring for her family, but she also knew that her duty was now greater than simply protecting her loved ones. She had to continue to fight, but now in her mother's memory. She made the hardest decision of her life. She did not hide, as the police advised her. She knew that if she retreated now, it would be the final victory for those who wanted to silence her. Instead, she gave an interview to one of the country's largest news channels. In this interview, she openly stated, "I am not afraid anymore. My mother died because the system did not give her a chance, and I will not let this system destroy me or other people who, like her, suffer from injustice and hatred. I will fight to the end, and if it costs me my life, so be it." Her words echoed across the country, causing a storm of emotion. Her actions sparked a new wave of support, but also a new wave of hatred. She knew she had crossed the point of no return. Then one evening, as she was sitting at home, there was a knock at the door. This time, it wasn't a policeman. There was a woman standing there, who introduced herself as a journalist and said she wanted to interview her again. But as soon as she let her in, the stranger pulled out a gun. "You don't deserve to talk," she said coldly. The world froze. Everything she had been working towards seemed to collapse at that moment. Everything froze as the woman with the gun walked into her house. Her heart pounded in her chest, and despite all her courage, she felt fear creeping over her like a dark shadow. The stranger's gaze was full of hatred, and she seemed determined. "You want to change the world, don't you?" the woman said, pointing the gun at her. "You think your fight matters, but you don't realize that you're just a pawn in a game you don't control." She didn't know what to say. Her throat was dry and her thoughts were racing, trying to find a way out of the situation. All she could think about was her son, who was sleeping upstairs. She had to protect him, even if it cost her her life. "Please," she said finally, trying to keep her voice calm. "I don't want to hurt anyone. I just want the world to be a better place." "Better?" The stranger snorted with disdain. "For whom? For people like you? You don't even know what's really going on. You're just a puppet controlled by others." It wasn't just a vicious reminder of her vulnerability, it was an insult that was loaded with hatred and contempt for people who fight for their rights. She realized that this woman was part of the very hateful culture she was fighting against, and that made her even more determined. "I'm not a doll," she said, raising her head. "I'm a person who lost her mother to this hatred, and I'm not going to stay silent anymore. My life matters, and my son's life does, too. I'm ready to fight for it." The woman froze for a moment, as if her confidence had been shaken, but then she tilted the gun toward her again. "You don't understand what you signed up for. I didn't just come to scare you. I came to put an end to your game." At that moment, her phone rang. It was her son, who had woken up and was calling her from his room. The woman with the gun jerked, her hand shaking. She felt that this could be her chance. "Please wait," she said, desperately trying to buy time. "Let me answer. He's just a child." The woman hesitated, but then nodded. She lowered the gun, allowing her to take the phone. Having collected her thoughts, she went to the door of her son's room, opened it and saw him, frightened, with eyes swollen from tears. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked when he saw her. "Everything is fine, darling. Just wait a little. I'll come to you soon." She tried to calm him down, looking into his innocent eyes. She knew this was the moment she had to act. Without wasting any time, she quickly turned to the stranger. "You don't know what you're doing," she said, trying to put all the force into her words. "You're not just killing me, you're killing the hope that something better is possible in this world. Your hatred will not bring happiness. It will only strengthen the division." The woman hesitated. A complex look passed over her face, and she looked away for a second. That moment of uncertainty felt like an eternity, but it was also a call to action. She thought again of her mother, how she always talked about the importance of not giving up, and how even in the darkest moments you need to find the light. "I don't want this hatred to continue," she said with feeling. "I want my son to grow up in a world where love and understanding will overcome hatred. It's not that hard if we just open our hearts. You know it yourself." Suddenly the woman lowered the gun. She paused for a moment, and her face changed. She seemed to be struggling with her inner demons when the sound of sirens could be heard outside the door. The police were approaching. "You don't understand," the woman said, her voice shaking. "I can't just leave." "You can," she screamed. "You can change your life, just like me. This is not the end. We can choose a different path." Before her eyes, the woman who had just been ready to shoot suddenly began to tremble. She was clearly experiencing internal conflicts, and at that moment, the culmination of their entire meeting came. The sirens grew louder, spurring her determination. She took a step toward the woman, who instinctively stepped back, still holding the gun. "I know you're hurting," she said, trying to reach out. "I know you're hurting, too, but hatred is not the solution. It only leads to more suffering." The woman closed her eyes. Her hand trembled. At that moment, she took another step forward and, to her surprise, the woman slowly lowered the gun and then threw it on the floor. "I can't live like this anymore," she said, her voice growing weaker. At that moment, her eyes filled with tears. She seemed to realize that she could not continue this fight based on hatred and fear. Suddenly, her cruelty began to dissipate, and something more appeared in her gaze: uncertainty, pain, and perhaps hope for change. Sirens began to sound at the door, and she felt that now was the moment when everything could change. The one life she had just saved could be the beginning of a new life for both of them. "We can change this together," she said, leaning toward the woman. "Together, we can create a world where there is no room for hate." The woman fell to her knees with a low groan, and it seemed as if her soul was being torn from her body. She did not know what to do all these years, living in the shadow of her anger and contempt. She had lost herself. At that moment, the police burst into the house. Seeing the woman on the floor with a gun, they immediately raised their weapons and shouted, "Get on the ground!" "Stop!" she screamed, raising her hands. "It's me, I'm here to talk to her. She's not dangerous." But the police couldn't know what was going on. They didn't see the struggle that was going on in the room. They just saw the situation, and they had a job to do. Luckily, it was resolved when they realized there was no threat in the room. She explained the situation, and although it was difficult, she knew she had taken the first step in creating a bridge between two worlds that were usually divided by hatred. Many months had passed since then, and her life was still full of challenges. The woman with the gun, whom she had not yet recognized, had eventually surrendered to the authorities and agreed to treatment. She had met her again after the incident and seen how they had both changed. Now, as they sat together, they each realized that they were connected by something more than just hatred. They were both women fighting for their lives and their ideals. As time went on, her story continued to evolve. She became not only a symbol of the fight against racism, but also an example of how to seek peace in a world filled with hatred. She organized new human rights initiatives that connected different communities and sought opportunities for dialogue. She realized that even the most difficult conversations can lead to understanding if they are based on love and acceptance. Despite all the pain she endured, her story was not only about struggle, but also about hope, about how to build bridges even across the deepest divides. Her son grew up in a world that was slowly changing for the better, and her mother would probably be proud of her for never giving up. Several months have passed since that dramatic evening when the life of the heroine and the woman with the gun changed dramatically. During this period, she continued her fight for justice and rights, actively participating in public life, organizing events and speaking at conferences. Each of her steps was perceived as a challenge, as a promise that no life would be forgotten, no soul would be left to the mercy of fate. But despite all the support, she increasingly felt the pressure mounting. The place where she once felt safe had become a battleground, and her story was causing controversy. Her name was on the lips of many, but so was the amount of hatred and threats. One day, after a busy day at a conference where she spoke about the importance of racial unity, she was returning home, tired but determined. As she approached her home, she noticed a group of people standing outside the door with signs. They were activists who supported her, but there were also opponents nearby who had clearly come to voice their dissatisfaction. Some of them carried signs with offensive messages. One read, "She's destroying our country." Others shouted insults and threats. Her heart began to pound, but she knew she couldn't back down. Images of her mother, her struggles, and her dream of a world where no one would feel afraid because of the color of their skin filled her mind. She raised her head and confidently stepped forward. People began to jeer and throw words of hatred at her, but she kept going. She knew that if she gave up now, it would be a defeat not only for her, but for everyone who supported her. As she got closer, the screams became louder. "You shouldn't be here," one of the women in the crowd screamed. "You're inciting hatred. We don't need your teaching." "I'm here because I have a voice," she replied, trying to cut through the noise. "I'm here to fight for all of us, to show that we can and should unite." The crowd seemed to be indignant, but there was power in her voice, and some began to listen. She felt that she had not only words on her side, but a sincere desire for change. But with each word, the tension grew. Suddenly, a tall man emerged from the crowd with a bright sign that read, "Your lies will soon end." His face was angry and he began to approach her. She felt her heart pounding, and at that moment she realized that the crowd could get out of control. "You must understand that your words can have consequences," she said, turning to the man. "I am not an enemy. I am simply a person who wants justice." But he only laughed, and the crowd began to buzz again like a swarm of bees. She noticed that some of them were starting to rise, and the tension in the air was palpable, but she couldn't back down. Suddenly she remembered the woman who had been in her house that night with a gun. In that moment, she had become a symbol not only for her, but for all those who wanted to understand that hatred does not bring peace. "I'm not against you. I want us all to be able to live in peace," she continued, raising her hands. "I want you to see me as a person, not as an enemy." Suddenly, someone in the crowd threw a bottle of water at her. She didn't have time to dodge it, and although it wasn't that dangerous, it was a signal. The The crowd exploded. People started shouting. Some started pushing her from both sides, and she felt like she was being threateningly surrounded. But at that moment, something unexpected happened. A woman who had once supported her came out of the crowd, and she screamed at the people who were attacking her. "Enough!" she screamed. "We can't let hate win." These words became a cry that awakened understanding in others. They began to disperse, and the tension began to subside. In the center of this chaos, she felt that her strength, her confidence, and her fight for the truth were becoming a living example for others. After that night, when the crowd had dispersed, she returned home, still shaking from the stress of the experience. However, when she looked into her son's eyes, she realized that it had not all been in vain. Every step, every word, and every conflict brought her closer to the light. In the following days, she decided to organize a meeting with activists and everyone involved in her fight. It was supposed to be an event where people could openly express their feelings, share their experiences, and together build a plan for the future fight for equality. The meeting included people from all walks of life, and despite the differences, the atmosphere was full of understanding and a desire to change the world. She felt that this was exactly what she needed, an opportunity to bring people together despite their differences. She spoke about her experiences, how she had encountered hatred and how it had affected her life. People in the room began to open up, and soon heated debates broke out about racism, how to combat hatred, and how to build bridges between cultures. During the discussion, a new woman entered the room, the same one who had once come to her with a gun. She stood at the threshold, and in her eyes there was fear and hope at the same time. "Can I join you?" she asked quietly, but her voice was full of determination. Everyone froze, and for a few seconds all that could be heard was the ticking of the clock. She felt her heart beat faster. This was the woman who could have been her enemy, but now she stood here, ready for change. "Yes, of course," she answered, opening the doors to a new life. "We are here to understand each other." The woman stepped forward, her voice shaking as she began to speak of her fears, of how the hatred that had been a part of her life left no room for understanding. "I've always been afraid of people who look different," she admitted, hanging her head, "but I've learned that hatred only strengthens the walls. I'm here to learn." The words she spoke echoed through the room, and suddenly the atmosphere changed. People began exchanging glances, and in those glances there was hope. This was more than just a conversation. This was the beginning of a new era, when hatred could give way to love and understanding. Several weeks had passed since they had started meeting. Each meeting had more people, and the atmosphere had changed. Each time they gathered, they became more than just acquaintances, they became comrades. Comrades in the fight for justice. She decided to organize a large outdoor event to raise awareness of the problems people of different races faced. It was to be a celebration of unity, where everyone could freely talk about their experiences and hopes. The day of the event was bright and sunny. She stood on the stage and looked at the crowd. People from all over the city had come, and it was a real outpouring of hope. However, she knew that under those smiles there were also fears and worries. As soon as she began speaking, the crowd was in awe. She shared her story of loss and struggle, and how they all had to come together to create a better future. But as she finished her speech, she noticed a man in the crowd who stood out. His expression was full of hatred, and he was bold. She felt her heart beat faster, and she knew that his words could affect everything she was trying to build. Suddenly he stood up and started shouting, "You are all deceived. Hatred is not something that needs to be destroyed. It is what defines us as a people." The crowd wavered. Some began to exchange nervous glances, and at that moment she realized she had to act. She raised her hand to stop the murmur, and, gathering her thoughts, spoke. "We are all here to seek understanding and unity," she said. "Hate will not solve our problems, it will only make them worse. Each of us is entitled to our own point of view, but we must seek peace in our differences." The words she spoke became a rallying cry. Gradually, her calm voice began to drown out the man's anger, and the crowd began to react. "We must not fear each other," she continued. "Instead, let us learn to listen and understand. Each of us has our own story, and these stories can lead us to unity." Some of those present began to raise their hands in affirmation of her words. It soon became clear that the hatred that this man represented could not withstand the power of unity. He, realizing that his words were not finding a response, suddenly lost his confidence and slowly walked away, leaving only silence behind him. The crowd began to applaud, and she felt that this moment had become a turning point. Hope filled her soul, and she realized that despite all the challenges, together they could change the world. As time passed, the movement she led continued to grow. People from different cultures began to unite, and their voices became heard at the local government level. They were pushing for changes that had once seemed unachievable. Despite all the trials and losses, she knew the road would be long and hard, but now she had allies. She understood that every small action, every kind word, could make a big difference. Each one was important, and their union gave them strength they never knew they had. And when she looked at her son, she knew that it was all for him, for his future, for a world in which hatred would be replaced by love, and fear by understanding. The place where they held their meetings gradually became not just a platform for exchanging opinions, but a real center of unification, where everyone could share their experiences and hopes. She saw how her efforts began to bear fruit. People from different walks of life came to learn and grow together, creating a space where there was less and less room for hatred and prejudice. One day, while she was preparing materials for the next meeting, she received a message from an old friend with whom she had not spoken for many years. The message said that her father, who was a well-known local businessman, decided to organize a charity event to support her initiative. He wanted all people, regardless of their race or social status, to be able to come together and discuss how to help their community. When she learned of this, she was overcome with a mixture of joy and excitement. It was incredible that even people who had previously seemed opposed to her were now ready to support her cause. In that moment, she realized that even in the most unexpected places, support and unity can be found. But, as often happens, the joy came with its own punishment. When she arrived at the event, she was surprised to see how many people had come. The atmosphere was full of anticipation, but she also noticed a few familiar faces from those who had previously been against her. Their looks made her uneasy. She knew that not everyone liked what they were doing, and that even in such moments of unity, she had to be careful. When it came time to speak, she felt the pressure, but her determination was strong. She walked up to the microphone and saw the hopeful faces in the crowd, and it gave her strength. "We're here to work together," she began, trying to ignore the tension in the room. "We're all part of the same community. Each of us brings something unique to the table, and together we can create something truly beautiful." But shortly after she spoke, one of the men who had previously spoken out against her initiative stood up and began shouting accusations. He said that everything she was doing was an attempt to undermine their society. The crowd froze. His words were like a bolt from the blue, and she felt fear creeping up on her again. "What do you know about our community?" he shouted, turning to the people. "You are only here to destroy what we have built." Her heart began to beat faster. She knew that this moment could be decisive. She could either retreat or fight his hatred. She took a step forward, gathering her strength. "I'm here to help us all," she said, trying to sound calm. "I want every person, regardless of skin color, to have the right to equal opportunities. I'm not an enemy, I'm an ally." At this point, the crowd split. Some began to applaud, while others began to whisper and condemn. The situation seemed hopeless, but she was not going to give in. "Hate won't solve our problems," she continued, feeling her confidence grow. "We must unite to create a world where everyone feels safe and happy." Immediately after her words, her friend's father entered the room. He was one of those who supported her, and his presence was not only important, but also symbolic. He raised his hand to attract attention. "Let me add something," he said, addressing the crowd. "I know how difficult it can be to embrace change. I was in this place when my business was just starting out, but it was because of the unity and understanding we found that I was able to succeed. It can be for you, too." People in the room began to whisper, and finally even some who had previously opposed her began to nod, realizing that they could be part of something bigger. The moment became a symbol of the possibility of change. After the event, she and her friend, who had been by her side the entire way, decided to spend the evening together. They discussed how they could further develop their movement and get more people involved in their cause. She felt that support was growing, and this gave her hope. But that evening, when they were returning home, her friend suddenly stopped. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't want to discuss this, but I found out that my father is going to support one of the groups that is against you." This statement shocked her. Her world seemed to be shaking. She looked at her friend, who looked guilty and confused. "Are you sure?" she asked, not believing her ears. "He supported our movement." "Yes, I know, but he thinks it could hurt our business. He thinks it could cause controversy, and he wants to protect his name," her friend replied, her voice breaking with emotion. She found it hard to breathe. The news hit her like thunder, and she realized she was facing another threat. Now even those who seemed to be allies were willing to betray her for their own gain. "I can't believe it," she said, feeling her strength fail her. "But it can't be true. He must know that this kind of unity is important." "I'll try to talk to him," said her friend, her eyes full of determination. "But you have to be prepared for the fact that he might not change his mind." The night became a time of reflection for her. She sat alone in her room, thinking about how difficult it was to maintain unity when even close people began to disagree. She realized that the fight for equality and justice was not only an external struggle, but also an internal one. Her thoughts returned to her son and the future she wanted for him. Soon her phone rang and her friend's name appeared on the screen. She answered, knowing that this conversation could change everything. "I talked to him," my friend began, her voice strained. "He hasn't changed his mind. He thinks your movement is just a temporary boom, and that eventually everything will go back to normal." Her heart sank. "I can't believe he thinks that," she replied, dejected. "We can't just sit back and wait for things to change. This isn't just a fashion trend." "I know," her friend agreed, but her voice still sounded regretful. "He says he wants you to know that you can always turn to him for help. But he won't support me," she interrupted. "That's not real help. I can't go on if the people who should be on my side are betraying me." The next day, she decided to take a step that was not easy for her. She called an emergency meeting with the activists to discuss the situation. She knew that this decision might upset them, but her heart told her that openness was the only way. When they had gathered, she stood before them, full of determination, but with a tremor in her voice. "I have something important to tell you," she began. "We've run into an unexpected problem. Some people who once supported us are now refusing to do so." The crowd froze, and she saw fear and concern in their eyes. "But I'm not going to give up," she continued, gathering her strength. "We have to be strong and not let situations like this break us. We have to move forward, no matter the obstacles." After her words, there were whispers and one of her friends stood up. "We are all here because we believe in you and what you do, but we need more than just words. We need a strategy to counter those who try to stop us." This statement spurred a discussion. They began sharing ideas on how to advance their cause and attract more people to the movement. Each suggestion became a step toward unity. A few days passed and they began to formulate a plan of action. They decided to organize a demonstration to draw attention to their struggle and to show that their movement would stop at nothing. They wanted to convey to people that everyone has the right to be heard. But it was at that moment that her friend informed her of another turn of events. Her father's business was embroiled in a huge scandal, with allegations of racist practices and exploitation of workers. It was a bombshell, and she knew it could impact everything they created. Together with other activists, they decided to use this situation to their advantage. They began holding meetings with local media and gathering people to discuss issues of racism and bias in business. It was not an easy decision, but they felt it was time to act. When the day of the demonstration arrived, she arrived with full confidence. The atmosphere was tense, but also brimming with energy. People from all over had come together to support their cause. In front of them stood a huge banner that read, "We are all equal." She looked at her son, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms. In that moment, she felt that the fight she was waging was not only for herself, but for him, for the future he would have. With that feeling, she stepped forward, ready for the challenge, ready to face any difficulties. and then she noticed a man in the crowd, the man who had spoken out against her earlier at the event. He stood with his head held high, as if he were searching for something. It made her heart beat faster. What if he had come to speak out against her again? As she approached to deliver her speech, a man suddenly stepped up to the podium. The crowd froze in anticipation. They could not understand what he was going to say. He began to speak, and there was no aggression in his voice, only sincerity. I came here to admit that I was wrong. I allowed my preconceived notions to cloud my judgment, but what I see here today is a powerful example of the unity and strength we can achieve together. The crowd began to buzz, and she felt her heart fill with hope. The unexpected turn of events was a turning point. The man's words resonated with the thousands of people standing around him, and in that moment, something changed. Together they began to sing, chanting slogans of equality, peace, and unity. She felt herself and her movement becoming part of something much bigger. The moment became a symbol of the hope and change she had longed for. But even in her joyful moments, she knew it was only the beginning. There was still a long-awaited struggle ahead, but she was ready. Her drive was stronger, and now she knew that together they could overcome anything. As the demonstration ended and people began to disperse, she looked down at her son, who was sleeping in her arms. "You will be part of this story," she whispered, her heart filling with a sense of determination. "We will all change the world together." And although trials and tribulations lay ahead, she knew that together they could make a great difference. After the successful demonstration and the turn of events with the man who changed his position, the movement gained new momentum. People began to realize the importance of unity, and her name became associated with the fight for equality and justice. However, with the new force came new challenges. Despite her initial success, there were divisions in her community. Some people didn't believe change was possible and continued to perpetuate old stereotypes. She couldn't believe that those who opposed her included people who had once been her friends. One evening morning, she met with a small group of allies at the local library to discuss next steps. Among them was Marie, a longtime friend and activist who had always supported her efforts. "We need more coverage on our side," Marie began. "We can organize a series of workshops and lectures to bring people the truth about racism and bias, but we need resources to do that." "I agree," she said thoughtfully, "but we need to create a dialogue, not just show how wrong the other side is. We need to teach people why this is important." James, one of the new activists who had come to their last meeting, intervened in their conversation. "I know there are a few landlords in our area who refuse to rent to people of color. This could be a great topic for our next workshop. If we can get local media involved, it might make people think about their preconceived notions." His proposal sparked a heated debate, and they eventually decided to organize an event focused on racial discrimination in housing. They began preparing promotional materials, distributing information on social media, in local stores, and at events. The day of the seminar arrived. She walked into the room where people were gathered, a nervous tremor in her heart. The place was full, and she felt a surge of energy when she saw familiar faces coming to support her. This was important not only for her, but also for her son, to whom she wanted to show that they could create a world free of hate. As soon as she started speaking, she felt that her words were reaching people. "We are here today to talk about how bias affects our lives," she began. "We want to open the eyes of those who don't understand that racism is not just a word. It is a reality that many of us face every day." She introduced several people who were willing to share their stories. Each story resonated with those present, and soon the atmosphere became more open and sensitive. People began asking questions, and the discussion gradually evolved into a productive dialogue. But during one of the questions, one woman stood up and began to speak loudly, causing confusion among many. "I don't understand why we have to talk about this," she said. "I grew up in a multicultural area myself, and I never experienced racism. Why should you make us think it's a problem when it's not?" The meeting froze. Her words were harsh, but they opened a new discussion. She felt the tension in the air rise. "But that's the problem," she said, trying to sound calm. "Just because you haven't experienced it doesn't mean others haven't. It's about understanding that everyone has a story." The conversation continued, and although some people had doubts, she noticed that some of the audience was beginning to understand the importance of the topic being discussed, and this gave her hope. After the workshop, she felt she had to continue this movement. She and her allies decided to organize a series of events to take to the streets and hold street workshops. Each workshop became a platform for open dialogue, and gradually they managed to expand their audience. However, she also knew that not everyone would agree with their efforts. Soon after the workshop, she began receiving threats on social media. Some were anonymous, others from people who were clearly opposed to her cause. She tried to ignore them, but each message left her feeling anxious. One evening, walking home after a meeting, she noticed that someone was following her. Her heart began to beat faster. She quickened her pace and then turned into one of the alleys, but the darkness did not give her confidence. Luckily, she was able to go into a familiar area and hide among the people. The next day, she discussed her concerns with Marie and James. They agreed that security at events needed to be tightened and that those performing needed to be protected. This added an extra layer of tension, but they knew it was necessary. At the same time, they began working on creating a program that would teach people how to confront racism and bias. They knew it would be a tall order, but they felt it was important. As they worked on the program, they decided to work with the local police to ensure greater security at events. The meeting with the police chief was tense. "I don't see the need for your approach," he began, eyeing them with distrust. "We're already doing enough to prevent violence in our area." "But it's not just about violence," she replied, trying to remain calm. "We're talking about bias and discrimination, and you have to understand that this is your problem. Too, we have to work together to create a safe space for everyone." At first his attitude was cautious, but gradually, listening to their arguments and stories, he became more open. It was a difficult start, but, as she thought, small steps can lead to big changes. As the weeks passed, she realized that her efforts were starting to bear fruit. People were becoming more involved in their events, and they were receiving support from unexpected sources. One day, as they were preparing for their next workshop, she received a message from a local school that wanted to collaborate. Her history teacher invited her to give a lecture to students about racism and the importance of fighting it. She happily accepted, knowing that young people are the future and they need to be given the opportunity to understand what it's like to live in a world free of prejudice. On the day of the lecture, she came to school filled with excitement. The students were open and interested, asking questions and sharing their views on the issue. This was an opportunity not only for them, but also for her. She could convey her ideas to the next generation. But with every step forward came the shadow of hatred. She knew that even the simplest discussions could cause aggression. They soon learned that some of their opponents were organizing a counter-event to express their position against the fight against racism. When she heard about the plans, she was alarmed. She knew it could lead to conflict, and she needed to find a way to prevent violence. The allies decided to organize a joint event with groups that support the idea of equality to show that they are stronger than hate. All this preparation was full of excitement and anxiety, and a few days before the event, she began to receive anonymous threats. She came to the event day with a sense of responsibility. She had people around her who supported her, but she knew their efforts could backfire. Deep down, she knew they were doing this not just for themselves, but for their son's future. As they walked out into the square, she felt her heart beat faster. The crowd that had come to support them was huge. She raised her hands, and the people around her began to chant. But when she saw the opponents gathering on the other side of the square, her heart sank. Their faces were full of hatred, and she realized that this could become dangerous. At that moment, everything changed. A fight broke out, and it took all her courage to stop it. She stood in front of her opponents, gathering her strength. "We are here to talk, not fight," she cried, her voice full of determination. "We will not let hatred rule us. Let us start a conversation, not a slaughter." At her words, one of the opponents stopped, and this caused a domino effect. Some began to retreat, but others were still full of aggression. She saw among them a man she recognized. It was the same man who had debated her at the first event. His face was distorted with hatred, but at that moment she noticed that he, too, was hesitating. Do you want your son to be proud of what you do? She shouted, looking into his eyes. We can change this world together. Everything froze for a few seconds. No one moved, and then, suddenly, he slowly stepped back. His eyes met hers, and she saw in them not hatred, but doubt. The crowd around them grew quieter, and one by one, people began to retreat, giving way to dialogue. Gradually, they began to gather in a circle, and she felt her heart fill with hope. I know we have different views, she began, addressing the crowd, but we can work together to create a better future. We can be voices of change, not hate. This time her words had an effect. People began to discuss their differences rather than fight each other. It was the moment when hatred gave way to humanity. After this event, they returned to their work with even greater determination. Her activism became a symbol of how unity is possible even in the most difficult circumstances. She knew there were still many difficulties ahead, but now she felt that they were capable of changing the world, despite the hatred that often tried to overshadow their efforts. Over time, her movement continued to grow. She and her allies began to receive support from various organizations, and soon their programs reached even greater proportions. These were steps forward that she had once thought impossible. A few months passed, and she felt it was time for a new phase in their movement. Together with activists, she developed a curriculum for schools that focused on racial equality, the history of civil rights, and how to combat bias. One day, she was invited to speak at a large event where representatives of various organizations and politicians would gather. It was a chance that should not be missed. She knew that her words could influence many people. The night before the event, she sat in her kitchen, hugging her son and reflecting on how far they had come. But then she received a text message that made her heart skip a beat. One of her activists had been beaten for his beliefs. It was a brutal warning that hatred still exists. She knew she had to speak up not only for herself, but for those who were suffering. She had no right to be weak. When the day of the event arrived, she walked onto the stage in front of a huge audience. The room was full of people, many of whom supported her movement, but also those who were against it. I'm standing here not just for myself, but for everyone who has experienced racism, she began. I want us all to understand that each of us has the right to be treated with dignity, regardless of the color of our skin. Her words filled the room with energy. She spoke about her experiences, her fears, her hopes, but most importantly, she spoke about how important it is to continue the fight. We must fight not only against racism, but against all forms of hatred that surround us. We must create a society where everyone feels safe and free. As her speech progressed, she noticed that even among those who were against her, some began to nod in agreement. It was a small but important sign that change was possible. At the end of the event, she spent time with the participants, sharing her ideas and plans for the future. She felt that many new allies had joined them. This was a sign of the change they had been longing for. But a few days later, her activism was tested again. Her car was attacked, and she found it with broken windows and vandalized. She felt a wave of fear wash over her. It was a clear signal that the enemies of her movement were still active. But despite all this, she did not give up. Together with her allies, she organized a meeting with local media to draw attention to what was happening. They understood that this was not only her personal fight, but also a fight for everyone who cannot be heard. While the world around her began to change, she knew her work was not yet done. She continued to inspire others and share her knowledge, trying to make people understand that racism is not just an individual problem, but a systemic problem that requires attention and effort. Every night when she went to bed, she looked at her son and dreamed of a future where he could grow up in a world free of hate. And although the challenges were never far away, she felt that by walking this path, she was becoming part of something greater than herself. Her story was not over yet. She knew there would be new challenges ahead, but now she was ready to meet them. With each step, her movement became more powerful, and in their hands was the power to change the world. She stood on the threshold of a new era, full of hope and opportunity. Every day she came closer to her dream of a fair and equal society, where everyone would have the opportunity to be heard. It had been months since the attack on her car, and although her movement was gaining popularity, she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows of her past still haunted her. Every time she went out or held an event, the fear remained with her. Her life felt like a constant game of chess, where every move could have an unexpected twist. At one of the events dedicated to racial equality, she noticed that one of the participants was very nervous. It was a young girl named Layla, who had only recently started activism and decided to join her team. "Everything okay?" she asked Layla as she stood in the corner of the room, looking out over the crowd. "I'm just worried," Layla replied, her voice shaking. "I heard that some of your opponents might come here today. I'm not sure if I'm ready for that." These words struck a chord with her. She knew that Layla was feeling the same way she had felt at the beginning of her activist career. At times, she herself had felt fear of those who opposed her movement. "You know," she told Layla, "fear is a normal reaction. The important thing is not to let it control you. We are here to change something, and that is why we must be brave." With these words, she tried to encourage the young activist. It was the moment when she realized that her experience could inspire others, and she decided to share her fears. When it was time to perform, she felt her heart pounding in her chest. Her performance was important, and she knew this was a great chance to show how important it is to remain united even in the face of threats. She walked onto the stage and looked out at the crowd. "I want to talk about fear today," she began. "We can all experience it, especially when we stand up for what's right, but it's in those moments that we have to remember why we're here." She spoke about her own fears, how difficult it was at times to fight this battle, and how she found strength in her allies and communities. This helped Layla, and she felt her fear begin to dissipate. But as she finished her speech, there was a shout from the crowd. She noticed several people dressed in dark clothes starting to approach. "We won't let you deceive the people," one of them shouted, his voice loud and confident. The crowd froze for a moment. The tension became palpable. Her heart began to beat faster, but she took a step forward to try to calm the situation. "We're here to talk, not fight," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "If you have something to say, let's do it constructively." Suddenly, a conflict situation erupted. The opponents began shouting and the atmosphere became tense. She realized that this was the moment she had been dreading, but deep down, she knew that she had to restrain herself so as not to make the situation worse. She had many activists on her side, however, ready to support her. They began chanting slogans about peace and unity, and soon the noise in the square began to change. Layla, feeling supported, took a step forward. "I'm here to say that we all have a right to our opinions," she cried, "but we must not let hatred divide us." Her words had an effect. Many people started to support her. At that moment, she saw that hatred could not win if people united for one goal. But the crowd wasn't just activists. Ahead of her, she spotted the man who had once spoken out against her at one of her first events. It was the same man who had led her to the most uncomfortable moments of the debate. Now he stood at the edge of the crowd, his face stone-faced. She felt a chill run down her spine, but this time she couldn't let fear get the better of her. She stepped closer and, looking into his eyes, said, "We are all here to build the future. You can choose whose side you want to be on." Her words seemed to break the ice. The man looked like he was thinking, and his face changed for a moment. Perhaps he understood that hatred only destroys. Finally, the crowd split. Some supported her, others remained in their positions, but seeing so many people standing behind equality gave her a surge of energy and determination. It was a sign that their work was not in vain. The next day, they received an invitation from a local radio station to participate in a discussion about racism and bias. She knew it would be a great opportunity to talk about their struggle, but she also knew that not everyone supported their movement. When the day of the taping arrived, she was excited, but also felt like it was a test. Her allies showed up for the show, as did a few of her opponents. At first glance, the atmosphere seemed tense, but she knew their movement mattered. On air, she tried to be as open as possible. She shared her feelings, experiences, but also tried to listen to the opposing point of view. The discussion was tense, but each of her answers was imbued with hope for change. "Why do you think your fight is important?" asked one of the opponents. "Hasn't the world become a better place? You may not have experienced it," she replied, trying not to give in to her emotions. "But that doesn't mean the problem has gone away. People continue to suffer. If we close our eyes to it, we will find ourselves in an abyss." When the recording ended, she felt like she had taken a step forward. Some of her opponents began to consider her words, and she saw one of them nod in agreement. The next day, a report about their discussion appeared on the news, and the reactions were mixed. Many supported her, but there were also those who opposed her. However, even so, she felt that she had done something meaningful. But with every success came a new challenge. Within a week of the recording, she began receiving more threats. One night, as she was walking home, she noticed she was being followed again. The fear gripped her again, and she felt her heart pounding in her chest. When she got to her house, she quickly closed the doors and locked the door. That night, she couldn't sleep. Staring into the darkness, she knew that the movement she was fighting for would not always be easy. The next day, when she came to meet with activists, her mood was depressed. Layla noticed this and approached her. "What happened? You look tired," she asked with concern. "It's just, I don't know how to deal with these threats," she admitted. "Sometimes I feel like I'm risking not only myself, but everyone who supports me." "You're not alone," Layla replied. "We're all here to support you. Let's do something to show that we're not afraid." It reminded her that support was what made their movement stronger. They began to discuss how they could respond to threats and show that they were not afraid. Soon they organized a day of unity to demonstrate their strength and determination. They called on everyone to come and declare their values. It was an act of standing up to hate, and she felt that was exactly what they needed. When the day came, a crowd gathered in the city center. People of different ages, races and cultures came to support the movement. At the front stood a huge banner that read, "We are all together against hate." Her heart filled with pride when she saw how many people had come. It was proof that their struggle was not in vain. But in the midst of the celebration, a loud scream rang out. People began to disperse, and she saw several opponents trying to break through the crowd. Suddenly, the situation got out of control, and she realized that she had to act. Gathering all her strength, she approached the crowd, ready to engage in dialogue. "Stop!" she screamed. "We are here to show unity, not hatred. If you want to express your opinion, do it calmly." At that moment, someone from the crowd shouted back, "We don't want your lies. You're just trying to deceive us." It was an unexpected turn, and she felt the tension rising again, but instead of giving in to her emotions, she decided to turn to her humanity again. "Let's talk," she shouted, hoping her words would stop the hatred. "We all have a right to our beliefs, but hatred shouldn't be a part of it." Some of the opponents stopped, and a dialogue began between the parties. It was a difficult test, but she knew that this was how they could begin to understand each other. After all, it was in dialogue that solutions could be found. It was a difficult moment, but she felt they were taking steps in the right direction, and while there were still challenges, she knew their movement was growing, and each step brought them closer to a world where there was no room for hatred. In the days following Unity Day, she realized that their movement was really starting to make an impact on people's minds. Little by little, the city began to receive offers of cooperation from local businesses, educational institutions, and organizations willing to support their efforts. It was a significant achievement, but she knew it was just the beginning. They had a lot of work ahead of them, and her determination to keep fighting only grew stronger. She knew that change was possible if they worked together. A few months after the successful Unity Day, their movement had become an integral part of local life. Over time, they began organizing workshops, school training programs, and community building projects. Every step they took brought them closer to the dream she had always spoken of. She remembered how her personal struggle had once seemed endless, but now that she could see the results of her efforts and those of her allies, she knew that change was real. At one of the activists' meetings, she reflected on how important support was. Each of them brought something unique to the movement, and by uniting, they became stronger. "We are not just a group of people," she began, looking at her friends and colleagues. "We are a real family. and together we can achieve any goals." Everyone in the room began to applaud. It was a moment of pride and unity that reminded them why they had started their fight. But as often happens in life, their success brought new challenges. Local news began reporting that some of the opponents had begun organizing their own groups. They were trying to use fear and hatred to fuel the conflict, but she knew that wouldn't stop them. Soon after, her activists began receiving threats. It reminded her of the first difficulties they faced. She knew that now, more than ever, the most important thing was not to give up, but to continue fighting for their rights and equality. She gathered her activists and offered them new ideas for work. "We have to put aside the hate and focus on what we can do to move forward," she said. "We need to strengthen our community and work to make sure people understand that hate will never solve problems." She decided to organize a new Unity Day, but this time with a focus on peaceful coexistence. They invited people from different walks of life to unite them around the idea of equality and cooperation. The event quickly gained popularity, and she felt they had the potential to achieve something great. The day came and they started the celebration in the park. People came with their families and gathered to celebrate unity. Different communities presented their cultures through music, dance and food. It was a bright and colorful event where joy reigned. She gave a speech sharing her thoughts on the importance of valuing diversity and working together. Her words were full of hope and optimism. "We are here to show that diversity makes us stronger," she said. "We can build a future free of hate if we work together." The crowd applauded and felt a sense of pride. This was not just an event, it was a symbol of their tenacity and struggle. However, as in the past, new threats came with success. As the celebration continued, a group of opponents attempted to provoke the atmosphere of unity. They began shouting insults and calls for violence, trying to provoke fear and hatred. She felt the tension building, but instead of giving in to fear, she thought back to her lessons. She stepped forward and raised her hand, calling for silence. "We will not allow hatred to overshadow our celebration," she said, confidently and loudly. "If you want to express your opinion, we are ready to hear it, but let's do it peacefully." To her surprise, some of the opponents stopped. They did not expect their words to provoke a response, and froze for a moment. It was an unexpected turn. Some of the participants in the celebration began to make arguments in defense of unity and diversity. It was a sincere discussion, and although not everyone agreed, the atmosphere remained peaceful. Soon there was an exchange of opinions. People began to voice their fears and hopes, and even those who had been against it began to admit that hatred was not the answer. She felt that this was a real breakthrough. In the midst of all this, she remembered why she had started this fight. It wasn't just for herself or her friends, but for future generations. She knew they could change the world. As the evening wore on, the party continued. People laughed and talked, and even though there was conflict, they were able to find common ground. It was an exciting time. She and her team continued their work, expanding their programs, creating new initiatives, and bringing more people into their fight. It wasn't just a movement, it was a wave of change that was reaching more and more communities. A few months later, they received an invitation to a national conference on racial equality. It was a major event that would be attended by activists from all over the country. She knew it would be a great opportunity to advance their ideas and bring their message to a broader audience. At the conference, she gave a speech that won the hearts of many listeners. She spoke about the importance of uniting and overcoming hatred. "If we want to make change, we need to work together," she said. Looking into the eyes of everyone present, "We can create communities free of hate if we take action." Her speech created a furor. After the conference, many people approached her, ready to support her ideas and offer cooperation. It was inspiring, and she understood that their movement was really starting to change the world. When she returned home, she looked at her son and smiled. All the effort they had put in had not been in vain. She knew there was still much work to do, but together with their allies, they could create a future free of hate. Thus began a new era in her life. She felt that their movement had become not only a symbol of struggle, but also a source of inspiration for many. Every step they took brought them closer to their dream of a just and equal society. she realized that it was important not only to continue to fight, but also to educate others. She began planning educational programs that would teach people how to deal with bias and hatred. Her confidence grew with each passing day. She knew that they could change the world, even if the path was difficult. And although hatred still existed, she believed that love and unity would ultimately prevail. She looked to the future with hope and determination. Together with her team, they were ready to take on any challenge, and their story was just beginning. It wasn't just the end of history, it was a new start. Dear viewers, what do you think about our story? Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced racism in your life that has affected you or your loved ones? Your stories are very important to us, and we value every word you say. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video if you enjoyed it. We are very happy for each of you and thank you for your support. We wish you a good day and a positive mood.